Okay, let's get started. Well, just like to say welcome everybody to our public square conversation. Gen Z and Democracy, How Do You Engage in the Digital Age? Hosted by the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute for American Democracy. I'm Liam Julian. I'm the Vice President of Programs and Public Policy for the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute. Just a few notes today about sort of how we want this to go. This is a conversation which indicates collaboration. So we really are looking for you to ask your questions to our expert panel, to share your experiences too, especially if you're Gen Z. And just Gen Z is like age 13-ish to like age 28. So if you're in there, you're Gen Z. So tell us, how you're engaging in right now in democracy and what you're up to. And so, while of course we welcome that collaboration and conversation, and we want it to be really interactive, we do have our core values, right? We're nonpartisan, we're fact-based. We really want to make sure that this conversation, this discussion is civil so that it can be productive. So to the extent that we can keep it, high level and talking about ideas and avoiding those ad hominem attacks. And I know there's a lot going on in the news, but if we can do that, that would be fantastic. So I've introduced myself. I'm one of the moderators. I'm joined by a co-moderator, and she's going to introduce herself now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Emily Fox-Millian. I am a junior at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. I'm a part of the 3+1 program. I'm also a broadcast reporter and anchor for Cronkite News, so you might have seen me there. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of this conversation and helping out today. Again, if you do think that your personal story or your question aligns with our core values, make sure that you're raising your virtual hand, which is going to be at the bottom of your screen, and make sure that you have your cameras on. That way we can see you if you're comfortable. And we're really excited.
Thanks, Emily. And now we'll introduce our expert panelists. I'm going to introduce Professor Mia Parrish. Professor Parrish leads Arizona State University Media Enterprise. She's the professor for media innovation and leadership at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And she's president and CEO of MAP Strategies Group based in Phoenix. She also served as president and publisher of the Arizona Republic and azcentral.com. And I think Emily is going to introduce our second panelist.
Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce Dr. Marie-Louise Polesk. She is an associate teaching professor at Arizona State University with a PhD in human communication and a background in journalism and public relations. She is a dedicated educator who fosters critical thinking and interdisciplinary exploration through creative ped pedagogy. Peda Can someone help me out there? Perhaps.
Pedagogical. It's
Thank you
tough.
so much. It's
Yeah.
early for me, folks. I apologize. She's taught over 30 distinct courses, both lower and upper division, and her teaching also highlights the importance of media literacy for navigating modern communication landscapes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to kick it off, and I'm just going to ask our expert panelists sort of a very broad question about what we're talking about today. What does the landscape look like when we're talking about Gen Z and how they do civic engagement, which I think is in some ways quite different from prior generations, but there might be some overlap. So really interested to hear from our panelists. And then again, audience, if anything they say, you want to get your hand up quick because we got a lot of people here, so we want to get to everybody. So make sure you raise your virtual hand to get in there. But yeah, so well, I guess we'll start with Dr. Pauless because she's on this side of my screen. So, and then we're going to Mia, Professor Parrish.
So one of the things that I really would like to say is that perhaps because the theme of the conversation today is social media and civic engagement as it relates to Gen Z, right? Social media perhaps should be one of the things that we recognize when it comes to Gen Z. They grew up with social media. And I just want to say that many times people think of social media as being something really evil. Other people are highlighting how powerful it is, but I would like to say that it's both, it has both dangers and opportunities. In terms of Gen Z, some studies have shown that they're more vulnerable and susceptible to mis and disinformation happening on social media. They're also taking their news more from social media, but also in terms of opportunities, social media for Gen Z means that they can create unique unique paths into career from social media. So we have content creators, influencers, right? So just as an anecdote, my son is Gen Z, and one of the things that he says is, "I want to become an influencer," right? So that was one of his. And even if it's anecdotal, it actually, I think, it resonates as representative of Gen Z, right? Wanting to be out there and recognized as influencers.
Professor Parrish?
Certainly, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Uh, Dr. Paulesk said part of what I was thinking about, and I think one of the big, there are two big differences of what's going on with Gen Z. One is that they are digital natives, never had an experience with anything but social media, with the internet, and with being able really to ask in real time questions that they don't necessarily, that they get the answer to, but they don't necessarily know how it got to them. So there's this weird vacuum of information where you're often really lacking context or historical perspective, and that has accelerated. So, in the even since I've been teaching, which is about 7 years now, the brain shift, both in critical thinking and in how news is gathered and what they trust, is disturbing to me. It has become a very quick switch to sort of like, Alexa told me that, so it's true, kind of mentality. And that's sort of the bad side of it. It's the bad side of technology. It also, I don't, like Dr. Paulesk was saying, I don't think social media is evil or good. It's a technology that can be used for evil or good. And it really has so much potential for goodness. We just haven't quite figured out how to utilize it in a really exceptional way, in the way that the fake news piece and that disinformation has cascaded through social media and really created a fundamental problem with how we interact with each other and how people learn and how they engage with civics. One other piece is, at the same time that this disruption in media and disruption and reliance on digital media and social media has occurred, there's been a decline in the trust in media overall, certainly legacy media, as well as government and other institutions such as higher education. So you've got this conflux of things that both makes it easier to just sort of get the answer and a lot harder to get the truth and real answers.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know, and I know Emily will have some questions too, but I'll throw one out for both of you, because I think what I'm hearing from both of our panelists is something that strikes me, at least, I'm not very smart, but strikes me at least as counterintuitive. And that is that Gen Z is less able to discern sort of fact from fiction on sort of social media. I would think that, having grown up with social media, with technology, that they would be the generation that would be like fake, 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 and it would be the older generations who would have difficulty sort of sussing that out. But I'm hearing something different from you both. Do you want to sort of tell me what's going on there? It seems a little different than what I would have expected.
I can start. So as it happens right now, I'm teaching actually a humanities lab on misinformation, and one of the groups is actually tackling this particular difference between older and newer generations, right? And guess what? They started with the assumption, or the preconceived notion that it's the older generation who have they have greater difficulty in discerning between fake and accurate news, right? But what they've discovered is that there is that yes, older generations are perhaps, I mean, the differences are especially in the way the misinformation is spread online. So older generations tend to spread more misinformation and disinformation. But with the younger generation, they have this difficulty of actually identifying even AI generated news. The reason why this happens is, I mean, some people say it's because actually with older generation there is an accumulation of knowledge and experience that is actually positioning these older generation in a better way to actually figure out what is true and what is not, right? The other thing, I think Professor Parrish said something that I think is really, really key. The patience people have and the responsibility they take to actually check the information and to actually make sure that they're informed correctly is low in younger generations. This idea of, you know, the social media and the way in which the information is not contextualized and you know, it's taken sometimes at face value. Another factor I think is we mentioned already influencers, right? So influencers, because X said so, right? You mentioned Alexa, but it's not just Alexa, all right? It's because X said so, it must be true. So I think all of these things contribute to this, and also I really think we should also think about the ways in which perhaps the education system contributed um, to, I don't know, to a lack or a gap in education when it comes to critical thinking, right? So all of these things are really important factors, and perhaps more than I can not think of right now.
I agree with all of that. But in particular, it's a funny gap that you're talking about, Liam. The older, so boomers, the older generation, and the younger generation are the two that have the most trouble discerning and are most likely to be taken in by fake news. I think I know they're for different reasons. So that older generation has a great trust in legacy media. They grew up believing in Walter Cronkite and, you know, have this identification with, I'm getting this information from this credible source. And then we have Fox News. And that has a very powerful and has had a very powerful effect on truth and reality and sort of the context of what's actually going on. And to Dr. Paulesk's point, they are infinitely more likely to share it because they already start with they trust this, it must be true, no matter how bonkers, there aren't caravans of people walking here from Central America, they'll take it and say it's true. On the other end, you've got Emily and her colleagues who have grown up in a time where there's so much information from so many different places being thrown at them, including bad actors who are deliberately creating streams of disinformation for profit or whatever other motives. And that also creates so much noise and chaos in the system, which is it's a fixture of this whole situation, where you just start to tune out, or you just start to think, everything's fake. You know, It's just this sort of laziness default. And when you couple that with, I completely agree with Marie-Louise that we have a failure on the part of the education system, particularly in terms of critical thinking skills, ferreting out facts. You know, it wasn't really embedded in our educational system in the way that I think we need to have it going forward, in really being able to question and figure, you know, actually have to go do the work to figure out if it's true. And then one more thing is on the influencer point, I read a story recently where 60% of influencers admit to not checking the facts of what they share. And that's 60% admit
Mm.
that they don't check. So it's higher, right? A majority of influencers are just sharing whatever they think sounds interesting. And often the things are things that are they're outrageous, right? And
Yeah.
those are more likely to be shared. And those are almost certainly not totally on the level.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, we know that Dr. Pawlesk's son, future influencer, will be part of the 40% to check his facts. But Professor Parrish understood. Yeah, we have news outlets now, Fox News, as you point out, definitely being, avowedly more on the right, and others avowedly more on the left. And now we have people who are able to essentially get the news from the sort of slant that they prefer, which doesn't always offer, the balanced perspective. So totally helpful to point that out. And I should also say that, my co-moderator, I'm not outing her. She outed herself as Gen Z earlier. So I don't know, Emily, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but while we wait for the audience to sort of raise their hands and ask some questions, maybe you have some thoughts as a member of Gen Z on this sort of topic we're talking about and what we were just responding to, fake news and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Well, in my perspective, I always am so interested in my own perspective, which is very narcissistic, but just coming as from someone with a journalism background, right? Who's been doing journalism now since I was 14 years old and now in college pursuing it full time. And I have this idea of what does fact checking mean? What does truth mean? What does fact mean? And how that differs for so many people in my generation. And what I'm really interested in is with the vast amount of information we're seeing online at our fingertips, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, all those come to mind. I think most recently back to April 1st in my own newsroom and this warning going out to journalists saying, hey, just a reminder, it's April 1st. Don't get caught retweeting. Don't get caught reposting. And those likes, those comments, those reposts really so quickly spreading that information that is false, that is not true. Even if it is as harmless as, the ASU football team painting their field maroon, which obviously is not true. Really, I suppose what I'm challenged by is I think there's this notion that Gen Z, that a fact check is really this deep dive into information. It's time consuming, it's exhausting. But really, what recommendation, what advice would you give to Gen Z just to start? What are those critical thinking skills? Where's the beginning for people where that is intimidating almost?
Yeah. Well, we do see, right, data that show, for better, that Gen Z lives in this online world, and so I guess what I'm hearing from all three of you is that when you're bombarded with this, there also is a fatigue factor. You can't check everything. You kind of just maybe just make a decision to either just go with this person because you just believe them because it's easy, or maybe you start to check out. And I think there are a lot of data that show Gen Z, while engaged in some ways, is also kind of more disengaged in other ways. Another sort of interesting kind of interaction there. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? What we're seeing with that?
Can I park that for just 1 second to
Yeah.
add a complicating factor? So Professor Parrish and Emily, you both touched on, information overload, and that's only part of the problem. I also want to highlight, so I want to start with this, and then to add to this, to highlight a point that Professor Parrish made earlier about where Gen Z, right? So Gen Z gets the news mostly from social media, and in bits and pieces, right? But information is always complex, and it actually requires, like I said earlier, patience. And one of the things that I think gets complicated is this, not just the lack of patience to fact check everything, but the lack of patience to actually read beyond a title and to actually make the effort to understand the information, right? And another thing that I want to respond to, right? You were talking about some media are left leaning, some media are right leaning. That doesn't mean that all of them, because of their bias, are unreliable. So I had this conversation with my I don't know why I'm bringing my family into this conversation today, but I had this conversation with my nephew who was like, well, but you're telling me this because, I was sharing an article from BBC, and he was like, but this is left leaning. Yes, but it doesn't mean it's not it's not reliable. So you were asking, how can we start? Well, that's how we can start with media literacy and actually understanding that being informed is a responsibility as a citizen, and being informed actually takes time and effort. So this is, I don't know, this is where I'm going with this, I think.
Yeah. Emily, we've got some questions. I see some hands raised.
Absolutely. Mary, I saw your hand raised first. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, Fox News went to court on the issue of whether they had lied in what they were saying. They won the case, asserting that they had a constitutional right, to lie and distort the truth. That's how they won the case. Now, none of that has ever been said about MSNBC or the BBC. I'm not aware of any attacks on the truthfulness of what they say. So I think it is lazy to equate the two and say that just because one is on the right and one is on the left, they are equally at fault in terms of distorting the truth. They are not equally at fault. Fox News claims that they have a right to lie and distort the truth, and they do.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. It's not necessarily always a matter of right and left, but it's a matter of truth. I think the point that we're just making is that there are outlets on the right and outlets on the left that are that own their own sort of bias in terms of, these are the commentators that we have and they have a left-leaning perspective, or these are the commentators we have and they have a right-leaning perspective. And so we have audiences now that are sort of able to say, oh, I consider myself more left or right-leaning, so I would prefer to get my news from an outlet that sort of reinforces my positions. But yeah, to your point, if any news outlet is distorting facts or just straight up lying, then really it doesn't matter if they're on the left or the right. We're talking about facts. So great point. Thank you for that. Molly, you want to come off mute and ask your question?
It's not really a question, more a comment. I came to Sandra Day O'Connor Institute as a member when I was in high school. And the reason I kind of came across this organization is because I was in high school. I took history, and then I took history in community college in American River College in Sacramento. And the amount of information presented was so different. And so many things were glossed over and kind of minimized in my high school course than the college course, that I really was kind of disappointed that there was not truth about how the Indians, American Indians, for example, were treated. So I came to Sandra Day O'Connor, and then I became an ambassador to kind of get other students more involved in democracy and promote civic engagement. Now I'm in college, I'm a freshman in college, and I have to say that the more I look into truth by mass media even, I'm really disappointed. I don't know if you have followed the New York Times, the involvement in the Blake Lively case. It is pretty sensationalist, but the bottom line is journalistic integrity is absent in so many levels. You can't just say it's absent in social media, because I refuse to read New York Times anymore, because it is trash. It is just trash. What they put out has nothing to do with reality. And they came out and issued a statement saying, we have no responsibility to fact check, and we have no responsibility to present both sides of the issue. They presented Lively's side, gave the other gentleman, Baldoni, I think his name is, they gave him 10 hours and then went to press in 7. 7 hours on a Friday night. I think
Mhm.
that is not journalism. So I find it offensive to say it's only
Yeah.
social media and influencers because mass media doesn't do their job. So it's
So,
not just, I think it's a breakdown of our civilization and democracy
yep.
because we don't take the time to evaluate facts and we don't take the time to understand and listen to each other.
Well,
So I think I really appreciate Sandra Day O'Connor because it encourages people to have conversations and to talk things out and see what really is each side's opinion before arriving on their own opinion. So that's all
well,
I wanted to say. Thank you.
no, thank you, Molly. And that's, I mean, we love to have the pop culture references, so thank you for the Blake Lively. But I think your point is something that our panelists can respond to for sure, which is Molly is a member of Gen Z and is kind of speaking of what we said. Like, there are legacy institutions, and the New York Times could not be more of a legacy institution. And Molly is saying essentially, I don't necessarily trust the journalism that's coming out of the New York Times. And for whatever reason, and we see that throughout Gen Z, right? This, as you were saying, Professor Parrish, a mistrust of institutions. So how then do people, how do you make the case to Gen Z to say that the social media or things should be held to sort of a different standard, and when they see institutions as inherently untrustworthy themselves? Do you understand what I'm sort of asking here? It's tough. Any thoughts? You're
Are
muted,
you
Professor.
asking me?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, Molly. Thank you. No, I'm asking our panelists. Yeah.
Well, I actually, as Emily mentioned, I also have a background in journalism, and I want to tell you why I got into journalism. I grew up in Romania during communism, so all I've known until 13 years old was the one, party propaganda of the state. That was the mass. This is how the mass media, the media environment looked like in Romania for. The first 13 years of my life, right? So when free expression and journalism started to develop in Romania, I'm like, I really would like to be part of this. And I've also gave up being part of that because of the ways in which the lingering authoritarian structures were controlling media in Eastern Europe. They were under the control of the former political parties and so secret police and so on and so forth. And where I'm getting with this story is that sometimes, even when people try to do good work in journalism, there are constraining factors. I always hear people saying, well, the New York Times is not as, what it used to be. It's trash, like you mentioned, Molly, right? But I also tell people you need to I don't think you can generalize and say everything that is published in the New York Times is trash. I think that we have to take it piece by piece, and that's where the difficulty comes in, right? We are asking journalists to be perfect, but there are people who are doing their job under the pressure of time, under the pressure of having only that much information at a particular point in time, under the pressure, of institutional constraints, and that comes with bosses and advertising and all sorts of other things. And I think that they might not be perfect. It doesn't mean that we need to discard them altogether. And I think that there is something to be said about, I mean, when you deal with people, and when you deal not with a plumber, right? How do you trust a plumber? It's basically the same thing. Some plumber might be more professional than others, and that's what's happening in journalism as well. I don't know if I'm making this point as clear as I would like it to be, but I'm hoping Professor Parrish would would help me here.
I'm totally going to do the cleanup act. No. So, I agree with you again, because we're all aligned here, but a couple of things. It's easier to just say like all legacy media is all crap. Like that's just, and that is lazy, frankly, and also not true. You know, it isn't true, to Professor Paulesque's point. There are many challenges, and I will set cable television in its own special little box because I have very serious concerns about them, more Fox than the others, but they all have a lot of skin in the confusion game and accelerating lack of trust in institutions. There is a very strong human drive to trust who you know. So you're most likely to believe the person, your friend, even like a Facebook friend that you've never met, than you are the New York Times or something. And it's gotten more and more like that. It's been like that from forever. And people have believed some really crazy things over time. I know that there were trees that grew sheep. True story. For like hundreds of years, people thought there were trees that grew sheep until somebody went looking for the trees and couldn't find them. And they were like, maybe there aren't actually trees that grow sheep. So, you know, this is an issue of longstanding of like who to trust, what is truth, how do we ferret out fact, how do we come to believe some things that are frankly bonkers. But in this time that we're in, social media, while again not evil or good, it is a very big part of accelerating the disinformation and misinformation and lack of trust in the media ecosystem. And it is also why all of this trust issue is also why people do turn to influencers. And, you know, you have lots and lots of even journalists who have more followers than the institutions that they represent.
I'd also add really quickly that, you know, it's human to trust who you know. It's also human to trust information that confirms what you want to believe or what you already believe. So it's really
That's part of what
challenging.
social media does,
Yeah,
right? It
it's
reinforces it. It sticks you in the group with your other people who think the earth is flat.
yeah, and the more you click on a certain type of information, the more that information comes to you, and this repetition effect makes it look like, you know, I've heard it, I've seen it so many times, it must be true, right? So all of these things, I think as we look at the media and at the journalists and try to blame them, we should also take a look at ourselves and take some responsibility for how we respond to certain information, for how we take responsibility and challenge ourselves with looking for disconfirming, you know, because I was talking about confirmation bias, right? So how can we look for disconfirming information? If I'm too comfortable believing something, perhaps I can figure out ways in which I can read extensively to, especially when it's about, I mean, when it's about you know, really consequential information, right?
I think there's also somebody in the chat is asking about, you know, don't these cable stations distort the news? There's a lot of gray, which is where many of these folks live. And so, you know, an example of that is as the stock markets were crashing, as they have been crashing, Fox News has stopped running a ticker, which they have run on every show, every day for the entire time of their existence, and they stopped. Are they lying? No. Are they distorting? Yeah. And are they doing that on purpose? Of course, right? And to a point, to keep people less informed or in the bubble or whatever their intention is. But there's a lot of gray things like that that are creating distrust or creating these confirmation bias bubbles, you know, and it's a lot easier to live in your bubble because it is so chaotic and confusing outside of it.
Thank you. Emily, we've got some questions you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna jump in here.
Yeah.
I don't know who raised their hand first, so I'm just gonna see. Patty, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question for our panelists?
I believe Miss McGrinnis had her hand up before me, and then it was myself, and then it was Mr. Nick.
Well, I appreciate you. Thank you for keeping track. Courtney, would you like
Thanks,
to ask
Patty.
a question then?
Sure, thank you. This is really going to take us in a different direction. My questions kind of take it a different direction. So if we want to bypass it, that's fine. But one of the things that I do is community organizing. And one of the things I feel like Gen Z has really added in the digital age is that ability to community organize through not just social media, but also just through the use of technology in such a different way. Um, I'm old, so you know, when we would do phone banks, you literally went to a building and picked up a phone that was plugged into a wall and called out. You know, now I've and some of the committees I've had a lot of Gen Zs just teaching, you know, amazing differences in terms of just text messaging, creating social media platforms to rally particular and target particular groups of individuals, and then and then teaching us kind of that concept of how much more effective you can be when you um, actually utilize your relationships, whether that be Facebook friends or friends on your phone or different orgs, than the cold calling that was kind of the standard way back in the day. So I was just curious, particularly for those of you with Gen Z, number one, do you find yourself doing that, or even whether formally or just even informally with your friends? And then number two, you know, how did you learn that skill? Is that something you were just like innately born in because you've always had that technology, or has someone been kind of teaching those concepts to you?
I suppose I can jump in here for a second. I'd love to hear from some of my Gen Z counterparts that I know are in this Zoom call today. So, you know, if you are interested in sharing your perspective, please do. And raise your hand and have your video on, your virtual hand, please. But it's really interesting, that concept. And I think that my understanding is a little bit niche coming from somebody with that sort of marketing background. So it was something that was taught to me, but knowing that growing up with social media, it also something that comes very naturally to people just through trial and error. I'm wondering what our panelists think about how Gen Z will sort of interact. And then again, would love to have some Gen Z folks share maybe their opinions as well. Any thoughts?
I just want to say first that I really love that we brought this into the conversation, right? Because in many ways, up until now, we talked all about the only about the dangers and the evilness that is out there on social media, right? Or the obstacles. It's really important to also recognize the how much of a powerful tool it can become in terms of organizing and in terms of you know, spreading awareness and mobilizing for a number of causes. And I think I can't obviously say anything about how Gen Z interacts or not. You know, I don't have firsthand experience. I would love to hear from the people in the audience more about that. But I know that there have been, so one recent example that I would like to mention, for instance, is Deja Fox, right? So she, as a content creator, she created this clout around her, right? And this following. She was the first content creator to speak at the Democratic National Convention, right? And she's now running for Congress. So I think that there are these examples, and because we're talking about Gen Z, I think that there are not too many of these examples. And I think that we should pay attention to the ones that are exist, right? In terms of, you know, how can Gen Z be more inspired to participate in civic life? Because one thing that we know about Gen Z is that they won't go on the traditional route, right? They won't call their representative. Many times they think the vote doesn't make any difference, and so why vote? So, but this they would perhaps I feel like this engaging on social media, they would gladly do.
Yes, I am glad that that was brought up as well. And again, it's a powerful tool for good and for ill. And so I do think social media is a very important part of the solution going forward, and how we are engaging in a cleaner ecosystem, the ability to correct in real time, like community notes. I mean, there's just going to have to be more things like that. Somebody in the chat asked about fact checking, and lots of research out now about how not very helpful it is, and that's a huge disappointment to me, sort of on the front side of this, when so many lies have been told and pushed out by powerful people. I was like, okay, we're going to fact check those. And once people have facts, then they're going to be fine. And it doesn't work. So we're going to really need, and technology, I think, is going to have to be a huge part of this, and figuring out how we have those cleaner environments, and it makes more space for the positive things like the community activism, and other ways that you have a civics in a positive form, working out its goodness, as well as informing people with truth and opportunity.
Thank you. That was great. So yes, Patty, as Patty told us, she was next, and then we'll go to Nick after that. Go ahead, Patty.
Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize. My camera is broken, and I guarantee you I'm not a bot. And a lot of good information has been disseminated here, starting with, I'm glad Ms. McGinnis did bring up the idea of how the Gen Zers have managed to use social media in a way to disseminate information. However, one thing that we wanted to talk about, Mr. Julian, I do believe you started the conversation asking the question, paraphrasing, of course, what are we missing? As a sitting professor and a healthcare professional, one of the things that the generation, and our generation as well, we tend to gravitate towards what we're comfortable with. Marie, you mentioned that people graduate. So when they hear information that some of us would say, they got to be kidding, they can't be buying. But once again, we're looking at a generation that was born with this technology. They're not going to turn a page to the New York Times. They're not necessarily picking up books anymore. It's audio. So I say that we have to revamp our educational system. I believe critical thinking is of the essence. Critical thinking can be taught at every level by age. A 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old. You can do critical thinking where they can evaluate and say, this makes no sense. I don't care who's putting the information, but if I don't have the tools, not given the resources, I don't know how to navigate in those particular silos. So if my friends are telling me this, and I hear it on every platform, I'm going to absorb it and believe it, because we know at that age, we learn by sponging. And we're going to sponge until it gets saturated to nothing, to goo. So we've got to do this critical thinking. And by it being extrapolated from the educational system, it was by design, just like we haven't taught civics in the educational system for 60 years. This is why we have the gentrification. This is why it can work. I should say. We always had it, but this is why it can work. This is why I believe my vote don't count. Well, why did the president allow this to happen? Well, there's three branches of government. Well, he's trying to wrote it now, but there are actually three branches of government. And each branch is a check and balance. And they have to work as co-partners. But if you don't know that, you're going to spill nonsense. Well, the president didn't put this into law. No, the president doesn't put things in the law. The budget and legislation come from the legislative body. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I just wanted to say those are issues that we must begin to readdress, because we lost 2 generations to this.
Yeah.
Now we're dealing more with mental health because my children need validation from strangers. I've got 120,000 likes what content? But we do have some wonderful Gen Zers that have come on board, content managers, and climate change and social justice. You have Jocelyn, you have Leah, you have Frost. These guys have really done great work. That's all I have to say.
No, there's a lot in there. Thank you, Patty. I mean, and one thing that Patty is bringing up, of course, is civics education, and sort of when Patty mentions that, you know, we're lacking critical thinking. A lot of times those critical thinking skills would have happened in a class where you were debating ideas of maybe a civics class, and maybe those classes now are being taught less, and maybe when they are taught, they're being taught less, shall we say, actively, because people are a little bit worried about the climate and that sort of thing. So I'd open it up, you know, to Professor Parrish and Dr. Paulesque and Emily as well, of course. Any reaction to all of that? And then we'll go to Nick.
I just want to reinforce this point about civic education. So Annenberg Public Policy Center every year conducts a Constitution Day civics survey. In 2024, they asked, you know, what are the First Amendment's rights? And 74% were able to name freedom of speech, only 39 freedom of religion, 29 freedom of press, 27 right to assembly, and only 11% right to petition. 22 also said that part of the First Amendment rights is the right to bear arms. So I really think that as a, and I don't have demographic information to know how many of these and how much worse is this for Gen Z. I just know that you know, when you look at the state of the civic education in public schools, you'll see that it's lacking, to be elegant. But I think that, you know, I know we're talking about Gen Z, but I wonder, and it's something that for all of us to think about how we actually need to build bridges between generations and collaboration and coalitions, and actually teach each other civic, to educate one another on civic matters, right? I had, when a few, and this is related, right? A few years back, I taught a class on publics and public opinion, and we were talking about protests and stuff like that. And one of my students was like, but do they have the right to protest? Okay, well, let's see. Do they? Let's figure it out together, right? But you know, simply asking that question tells me how much we don't know, how much that particular individual did not know, but how much we collectively don't know. So if we don't know what the vote can do, if we don't know what our rights are, right, then how can we become involved? How do we care? And one more thing, and I only want to just hint towards this idea. I really think one of the things that we touched on but not really highlighted, articulated, is truth as a value. For many of the people who are spreading, like you were mentioning earlier, I think it was Mary, you know, they don't care that they lie, right? So do we care? Do we value truth? And, I would really love to see how we can make truth great again.
What a thought. What a lovely thought. The work that the Institute, the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute for American Democracy is doing in civics is really exciting to me and overdue, right? I'm really glad that we're, I don't know, making civics sexy again, or maybe it was never sexy, but we need to make it sexy. But we really need some very deliberate, very extensive, very early intervention, understanding and education around civics. I know Emily knows what's in the First Amendment because she's one of my students and I talk about it all the time. I spam them all the time about this. And one of the things I talk about is how fragile it is. And if we don't understand it, we can lose it really quickly. And you see a lot of not just not knowing what's in it, but not understanding what it is, including everybody, spinning about, I can say whatever I want. I have the right to free speech. You can't tell me that I can't tell a lie. I'm like, you can say whatever you want. It doesn't mean there are no consequences. And you aren't protected from, Tesla or whatever. You're protected from the government censoring you. So it's a really interesting under education situation that we're dealing in a time when we have so much information. So we don't have an information problem. I mean, there is way more inputs than we could possibly ever deal with. But we are at a state where we were not prepared, and our brains are not wired to deal with this much coming at us in this way. So I don't have an answer to it, but it definitely involves education as a piece of it. And some deprogramming. I mean, it's been going on for kind of a while now, and I'm not sure quite how we get out of it. But media has a role, education has a very strong role, and institutions like the Institute, stepping up and leaning in and being a part of that, where it wasn't their job before, but now it's everybody's job, I think.
I think that's so interesting also. And I would love for, again, my Gen Z counterparts to maybe join the conversation and talk about what were those civics classes, because I remember taking them. As someone in Gen Z, I remember those classes. Did they sort of change maybe tone as I continued my education? Sure. With COVID-19 and other things affecting growing up, there was just a change. And obviously it's specific to me. I was in Colorado. It's different for everyone else across the nation, but still, I think that there was, this sort of shift. And I want to see if anyone else my age agrees or maybe disagrees, and would love to hear your perspective. But I think that's really interesting. I know we have another question. Liam, do you think we're ready for it? Perfect. Nick, if you want to unmute yourself and ask our panelists.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Great. Yeah, hi, my name's Nick. I'll give a little bit of background about myself. I'm a cybersecurity major. I'm not really a civics major at all. I'm just a normal guy. I like to, just work out, go to work, sleep, and, play video games sometimes. But what I do, how I usually get my news is sometimes will just be podcasts because I like daily cyber brief for more cybersecurity news. But what I noticed, like I did like the Joe Rogan podcast more for stories from like celebrities and things. It wasn't that political. But what I noticed during the 2024 election is just, more politics would come onto those podcasts I listened to. And that's kind of leading up to kind of a question I had is kind of for any of you guys is, do you believe that podcasts like had a significant impact on Gen Z voter engagement in 2024 election? And do you think, like Kamala Harris was on podcasts, but the Joe Rogan podcast had a lot more outreach to Gen Z, and you're kind of talking about how trying to get more outreach to Gen Z, and it just seems more like people my age, because I'm 28, so I'm at the cusp of kind of Gen Z and millennials. Do you think if she was kind of appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast, if that would have affected her campaign and her ability to connect with younger voters? It's kind of because, she was on a different podcast called Call Her Daddy, and, it didn't get really as many views, but I know, she was invited to Joe Rogan, but it apparently didn't happen. I just was wondering if you think that podcasts are more the future, and if you think that had a big impact on the outcome of the election, 2024.
Thanks, Nick.
I don't think she would have won if she'd gone on Joe Rogan. I don't think that would have been the thing that helped. But to your broader point, I do think that, and we talk about this in my class, you have to be in the right place where your audience is to reach the audience, right? And the audience, Emily is probably not watching Fox or MSNBC, which somebody asked, like that's not where, well, she may be, but her generation is not engaging really in mainstream media to any great extent. I mean, even my journalism students aren't, unless I make them. And so podcasts therefore become much more important and powerful. And it's a little dangerous because I don't know that Joe Rogan started out saying, "Hey, I'm a journalist." He's a celebrity in, entertainer, right? I mean, it's more in that line, and that's a lot of the Fox hosts too. You're dealing with something that's different than a pure play journalist, and they have a different set of intentions with the work that they're doing. But certainly, podcasts are where people, many more people in a generation are going to for news, and part of that is because you trust the people, like individuals that you're interested in. And that's a lot easier to be like, oh, I heard on Joe Rogan versus I read in the New York Times. There's just something about that is more confirming and more personal, and often more true, right? But you're also in a podcast space, to Dr. Paulette's point, that is confirming your beliefs. You're like, yeah, I heard on Joe Rogan, and then I told my friend, and he heard it too, and you just end up there's confirmation bias in a lot of ways when you're stuck in these media circles. And that's not a dig on Joe Rogan. I mean, he's doing his thing, but that isn't the best source for all of your news and information, and certainly not context in it.
I also would like to add that there are podcasts and podcasts, and some of them are made by journalists. That's one thing. I also think that many more people, or I'm not necessarily not just Gen Z, but many more people like news entertainment rather than news. So podcasts, many of them fulfill that need. But I also want to add that for Gen Z, so the channel definitely matters, right? But there is another problem or another thing that we might aspect that we want to take into consideration when it comes to Gen Z. It's there's accumulating evidence that this generation, and many people talk about millennials and Gen Z together, but these two generations are very different from everything that came before them, and their values are very different from the generations before them, that the current messaging of either party might not be appealing to them. So one of the things that I was it was really interesting to read as I prepared for this conversation today is that young conservatives, for instance, are more liberal, have more liberal views on racial equality, climate change, universal health care, and abortion. So there are a lot of changes across the the political spectrum of Gen Z that makes this two-party system insufficient, and they're disappointed and disillusioned with traditional politics and politics as usual. So I think that's and because by 2028, millennials and Gen Z will probably they're on their way of becoming like 50% of the eligible voters. I think that there's a lot of work that political parties have to figure out if they want to appeal to these voters.
Well, thank you very much. And that is going to bring us to the end. This has been a great conversation. So I want to thank, first of all, our panelists for their great sharing their great expertise with us. My co-moderator, Emily, thank you very much. Well done. And all of our audience members, thank you so much for engaging and asking your great questions, sharing. That was really appreciated and made for a great conversation. So if you're interested, o'connorinstitute.org is where you can find us and learn about more of the work that we're doing on a lot of the topics that we talked about today. So once again, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day.